Welcome to part two of our online series, Because We Matter, a collection of webinars exploring how anti-Black and systemic racism impacts the lives of Black Canadians. Last week, in part one, to describe systemic racism, we used the analogy of a house with many rooms. And reflecting on the killing of George Floyd, we recognized that police violence was one of the many rooms within this house. But our personal stories show that anti-Black systemic racism is not just contained to one room, there are many rooms. The rooms we have chosen to discuss here are criminal justice, education, food security, and mental health. And we'll discuss and examine how they all intersect. To draw a parallel, I have two young children, and they all have bedrooms and they have shelves with boxes for their toys. Yet when I walk into the bathroom, I see toy cars on the sink. And when I look at the dining room table, I find dolls on the table. And when I sit on my sofa, I sometimes find blocks in between the cushions. Things spill out into other rooms all the time. The same can be said for systemic racism. The systems, the institutions, the challenges, they all overlap and are connected. Nicole, when we speak about education, I feel like we speak about rooms within rooms. In high schools, students can take an academic level course, or they can enroll in applied courses or the essential programs. The Toronto District School Board, on a fact sheet called Programs of Studies from December 2013, noted that those who identified as Black comprised 12.6% of the high school student population. Yet, Black students are significantly underrepresented in the academic programs at 8.8% and overrepresented in applied programs at 23% and in the essential programs at 29%. Nicole, I know that you and I have talked endlessly over the past, even a couple of years about this. I'd just love to hear from you.
Myself. Sorry, I mute myself there. I'm not surprised by those stats. And often when I look around classrooms, I can see those stats in real life. And often it's not just Black students, but it's Black men or Black boys that are especially absent from our academic stream in education. And there's different reasons. It's the streaming of students from grade 8 into the secondary school. And sometimes it's about parents don't understand what that streaming means. It's not that students cannot have a college pathway or a workplace pathway. I think that the issue with streaming is the overrepresentation of Black students in particular streams. And if you know the system or how it works, is that if you're in the stream to do on the academic stream, so you're taking grade 9 academic courses, it just opens up the pathways for you to have choice, right? Because by the time you get to university and you're taking a grade 12 university course, you can use that university course to apply to college, to apply to an apprenticeship program, to apply to university. And then if you choose to go into the workplace, you can do that. So when we stream Black students into the applied level courses, it's not that we're saying that Black students shouldn't go to college or go to the workplace or do the apprenticeship. It's saying that we do not want to limit Black students from all of the options that are available after graduation, right? Which is why it's important for Black students to be given the opportunity, right, to be rightfully placed in academic classes. And I know that the TDSB has moved towards getting rid of academic streaming at the grade 9 level. It's called what is it? Academic for All, or enhanced pathways, which I think I'm in full support of. But when we're talking about these rooms in rooms, it's when we do those kind of things, how do we support Black students, which goes to like spec ed, IEPs. A lot of Black students are given or it's suggested for them to go on IEPs, which I completely support. But the IEP is meant to help you in your class, not to stream you within a particular program. So if you're a Black student who is on an IEP, you can still be in an academic class and get those supports to be successful, But what we know happens to Black students is once they are put on those IEPs, they're often streamed into these applied or essential level courses, not because they don't have the cognitive ability to perform in academic classes. It's just that there's this um, unfair correlation that they can't handle it when they're on the IEP, but other students of other backgrounds can be on those IEPs and be successful, which is what the point of an IEP is, to have success, to support the students, to fill, help support the gaps that maybe they have, or to just give them the supports that they are legally supposed to get, right, in order to be successful in school.
And I think like a part of this is that some students are being encouraged. Clearly, Black students are being encouraged by some teachers, perhaps when we talk about implicit bias, to apply for the applied level programs as opposed to the academic route. I don't know, Nicole, can you share your story and your experience kind of in this that we've talked about over the last little while?
When I was in then OAC,
what is that?
years ago, I was applying to go to university. Remember, back then it was a paper application, right? It wasn't like an online application. You went, you filled out your paper application. So, in the PA system, it's like, everybody come down and get your application for post-secondary school. So I walk into the guidance office and I'm like, okay, great. Can I get my application? And the guidance secretary was there with the two applications. She had the college application and she had the university application. And she said, well, which one are you applying for? And I said, well, I'm applying for university. And she's like, you sure you're not applying for college? I'm like, no, I'm applying for university. You sure you're not applying for college? And she kept trying to give me the college application. And I kept saying, no, I'm applying to university. I need the university application. Finally, my guidance counselor, who I had a relationship with, I would go and see her and that kind of stuff. She heard the conversation that was happening. She came out of their office and she picked up the university application and she put it in my hand. And I said, thank you. And I walked out. But imagine if I didn't have that guidance counselor there. And imagine if I wasn't a student that constantly was pushing, no, I need the right application. I need to, so when we think about education, we always look at education as being like that great equalizer. But the gatekeepers, the teachers, the guidance counselors, the secretaries, right? They have to be a part. And when I say they, I'm including myself, right? We have to be a part of allowing to open that gate for everybody. And we really do have to check our implicit biases about Black students in particular, because they come out in huge ways and they have large implications when it comes to the education of Black students.
And you see this because a lot of students, and you're not the first person with such a story. All of us here, I'm sure, know many, many, many students and have similar experience, but many students have had the same experience in school where their teacher has strongly encouraged them to take the applied route or the work placement route. And one of the challenges is that in our community, sometimes we don't always have parents that can advocate for us because of job opportunities that allow them to work night shifts and can't always attend, meetings and stuff, but they can't get involved as much as sometimes we need them, because not everyone has a strong connected voice as you did, and you think about then what happens if you yourself either didn't have an advocate, your guidance counselor, or didn't have a parent to advocate for you. And here you are, excited to go to university, but really kind of listened and fell into this plan and ended up, applying just for the college route.
And it does happen, right? And that's the parents sometimes don't feel like they understand the system, or they've had their own experiences with the system, the education system. And so that kind of impacts how they engage with schools, how they come into schools. Parents are trusting schools to do the best for their child, right? But at the same time, they have to realize that because we're talking about systematic oppression and systematic racism, a lot of things are ingrained within the education system, mental health system, or whatever. And so they really have to be strong advocates for their children. Or, for me personally, I encourage students to find strong advocates within the building, whether it be another teacher, a child and youth worker, a VP, a principal, even their own classmate, but who might be a strong advocate for them to to help them. And I also encourage my students to really learn how to speak up for themselves and be assertive, right? And be their own advocate, which is a huge thing for Black students, right? Feeling belonging, feeling like their voice matters in our institutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and without that, we need the role models as well for a Black female teacher, Black male teacher to be in a school to show, to be an example. And we see an underrepresentation in our teachers' colleges as well. Like, what was your graduating class like for you?
I don't know about I don't know my full graduating class. I was lucky to be in a program at my teacher's college that specifically focused on urban education.
Okay.
And so what ended up happening was there were a lot of teachers of color in that particular program. But as I walked through the halls of my school, I there were not a lot of Black teachers walking through those halls with me, right along with me. And I found that in other spaces, especially not in that cohort space, we're going to call it, a lot of times I became like the speaker for all Black people, right? And I was just like, whoa, like I can't speak for every Black person, but I can speak for myself. And it's just because like the underrepresentation of us being there is a major you know, a deterrence, or it's not really a deterrence, but it's an issue because, like you said, our students don't see us represented. And because they don't see us represented, a lot of times our voices are not heard in curriculum decisions, if they're not heard in leadership decisions in terms of who are the leaders in the building, who are the principals, the vice principals, the ACLs, or the PO, what we call PORs. Those voices, those leadership voices for Black teachers need to be present as well, because these are the people that are making decisions in these institutions.
And you see this across so many different faculties at university where we're underrepresented. I think, as you all know, and most people have heard now, that the University of Toronto's medical school for the graduating class in 2024 now has 24 Black students admitted into that graduating class. And this is up because in 2016, there was only one Black graduate or student in a class of 256. So significant underrepresentation across different sectors in professional fields as well. And you can see the impact later on. We know the stats that say that generally speaking, individuals that graduate from university have a higher graduation income than those that graduate for college in general. And then it impacts other things, like you have this ripple down effect. Again, the different rooms within the house. You think about, if I have a lower earning potential, we think about, I want to buy a house. Well, how much more difficult is it for me to buy a house, especially if I want to live in Toronto, if I'm not making as much money, if you weren't able to become a teacher, how it impacts different things. One other area sorry, Nicole, were you going to say something?
I was just agreeing with you. I was saying absolutely.
And one other area then, and thinking about you, Ucha, as we move, it makes me think of food insecurity, a topic that we briefly touched on in the first webinar, but didn't get really to flesh out. Because if I have a lower earning potential, and even if I have a house, I could be house poor, and I'm still struggling. And now we run into this conversation about food security. And for many people, this might be a new concept for them that they might be completely unfamiliar with. Maybe, Ucha, could you just kind of introduce us to this conversation?
For sure. So prior to my current role, or my current, role, I'll just put it there. I spent about 9 years working in food for food security. For one of Canada's largest food security nonprofits agencies. I also spent a lot of time during this time, working with from the national to global world, looking at food policy, looking at the various forms of food inequities, food sovereignty. And for today's conversation, I want to frame food security as it's defined most commonly as inadequate access to food due to lack of income. And so when you look at it from that lens or that perspective, there are many other pieces that are, or different ways of looking at food insecurity. But from that perspective, which is a common, and accepted definition, um, for many Black Canadians, this is an overwhelming, issue and overwhelming a challenge and hurdle for them to overcome. Because if you look at some statistics from the Broadband Institute that were just released earlier this year, I think in February during Black History Month. Um, so, overall rate of food insecurity in Canada is 12.4%. Black households or Black households across Canada, it's 28.4%. If you look at Caucasian households, it's only 10% across the entire country. And so through the work that was done, I think it was in partnership with Proof and FoodShare, they came up with some hard statistics that identified that Black Canadians are 3.5 times more likely to experience food insecurity than white households, so the Black households, and 1 times likely to when adjusting their education. So there are definite linkages. When you have access to opportunity, there is a shift in that narrative around income sourcing. Not to say that the policies, procedures, and all of these other systemic barriers aren't still issues for Black families, Black individuals to navigate, but these are historically, this has been a historic challenge for our community. And I know, some people watching might be saying, yes, this is a challenge for not just Blacks and not just, there are other communities, newcomer communities, other racialized community groups that experience this. But historically in Canada, the Black community and Indigenous community have been the most oppressed by our food system. If you want to look at going back to so-called settler times, you would look at, the blatant racism. I remember being in school and looking at, researching documents, looking at, the treatment of newcomers to Canada, even if we relate to our own parents and their experience. I remember my grandfather saying when he came from Jamaica, somebody tried to give him canned food or what was it, a donut, and talking about how he felt oppressed to eat the donut because he wasn't familiar with that food. And, just even what we go through, I remember personally being in grade 6 right here in Scarborough, Glen Ravine, and, your parents pack your lunch and you pull out your, this time my grandmother decided to put, rice and peas and curry in there or whatever, and you open it up and you now have to not only defend the food that you love, but you have to explain to everybody in the room what it is that you've brought. And if it wasn't approved, I was blessed to go to a school at that time that was predominantly, first generation Caribbean. So most of the people got, the bully beef and rice and all of these different things that we would be bringing, or bully beef and hard dough bread. That was like a common. But you'd have to explain to certain people, sometimes even your teacher, because at that time we didn't have lunch monitors, that, hard dough bread was still in fact a bread, right? Like all of these different things. And there's always these microaggressions that go along with our food system. When we look at, the linkage of social determinants of health, and we look at, something I advocate for, as we've just put in a major commercial kitchen here, and it's actually a food literacy space. So it's an edible kitchen. And the whole idea is that we're going to shift. It's not just okay for us to be providing meals. The meals have to be culturally appropriate. They have to be nutrient dense. And the children, individuals serving the meals, volunteers need to understand, be food literate. They have to understand the impact of the food on your overall wellness. And this has been a major gap within our community. I mean, we can go as far as talking about, cultural foods. I can speak from an Afro-Caribbean perspective. Others may have maybe some Latino influence. However, your cultural makeup is. A lot of the foods that we continue to eat as a culture are probably the bottom feeder, of the food system. When we look at our beloved bully beef, it's probably the worst type of food that you can ingest. And we historically, I remember my grandmother saying, when she came to Canada, this would be in the late 60s, maybe 1968. She said maybe the first 10 years you would get chicken wings and oxtail for free at the butcher because it was scraps. It wasn't until they noticed that this was a revenue generator, and and more with the immigration changes in the city of Toronto, that they actually started charging for these because it was waste. It wasn't common for the Canadians at that time, or the majority, to be consuming those foods. So we have to look at it from that literacy perspective. That's what we're doing here with the children and the youth that we work with. Um, we also have to look at it from on doing a lot of the mental and historical damage that we have in respect to our place as a people and culture where it comes to food and agriculture. As I've lived on a farm for about 8 years now. Very proud owner and proud to be one of the few. When we moved out there, it was less than 1% of the community were racialized, period, meaning Black, South Asian, whoever. Glad to share that that's gone up to about 4%, which is a huge push for that area. But the reality for us was that we wanted to make sure that we weren't just talking the talk with our children when it came to access to food and having access to your space to grow food. We wanted them to have that experience. And I realized that's not, the way for everybody. But I think it's very important for every Black child to understand that our culture as a people led the entire agricultural complex as we know it today. When you look at Imhotep, and when you look at, George Washington Carver, all of these great geniuses, but due to racism, were kind of underwritten in history, were the fathers. You look at the Moors of Spain, like they were scientists way before their time, that were basically sharing, because we're a culture that shares. Like if you go to the continent of Africa, I've been to Tanzania, I've been to Ghana, you immediately people are sharing. They want to share their culture. It's an oratory culture. We share our history. We share everything. It's not a documenting culture historically. We're now being more diligent with that. But it's a very important, I worked with a group of youths a couple years ago who were from a West End community, Jamestown. They call it the African Horn. It's a large Somalian and Ethiopian community there. And we took this group of youth to Detroit to look at some of the food advancement that the Black community had been working on, with D-Town farmers and all of these. Basically, it's a community, a collective of Black food growers that have come together and reclaimed empty spaces, so abandoned parks, buildings, so on and so forth, reanimating them into food aggregation spaces. And at one point I was in tears because these were youth that were going into university or in post-secondary somewhere, and they were sharing that they just thought the food came from the grocery. Like they didn't understand the growing concept. Like they were in awe and taking selfies with tomatoes in the ground because it was like the first time. At first I thought they were just being, they were being ignorant. But I realized that, when we had some downtime, and we were really reflecting on our experiences throughout the days, some of these youth shared that from they immigrated to the country, they moved to their particular building and never left the 4 streets that keep that housing intact. And I kind of kicked myself because I know from where we're from, we still rep, to this day, Scarborough to the fullest. So we, Derek, I'll give you the.
Yeah, no, Ucha, I mean, this topic's so important, and you're so right about that. that so many students or so many children aren't, don't even leave those four corridors, of their community and actually get to see a farm. Also, one of the things that we talk about when we talk about food security or food insecurity is food deserts.
That's right.
So I'm from Scarborough, and in my area that I grew up in, it was a low income community, and our immediate walk-in grocery store was then called Dominion, now called Metro, which is one of the most expensive box stores.
That's
so
right.
Most people today, myself today, I still don't shop at Metro. It's just too expensive. And you put this store right in the middle of a low income community where your only options were for my parents, were either to walk and pay more for really expensive groceries, of which certainly at that time, they had such a limited ethnic kind of line of food anyway. So, I mean, you couldn't get any real curries or anything like that from Metro back then. No. Now I think they've expanded the line. Again, I don't know, but that was the option was either go there and spend extra money for groceries. And we think about the nutrient dense food like your berries and fruits and vegetables, or you then take a bus and you have to go outside of your community just for grocery shopping, pack it all up. Yeah, exactly. And then come all the way back to your apartment building just to go grocery shopping. And these are things that many people take for granted because you have a car, you just hop in your car and you have all these different options to go. But when you're in a low income community, of which most is Caribbean, Black populated, you don't have that option.
That's right. I think, we come from, we grew up in the same community, Markham and Eglinton area. I can share from my lived experience that this East Scarborough has been a food desert, as it's defined now. For historically, I could think back to the early 80s. We would, at that time, they had a Caribbean store, Fisherman, a Jamaican Caribbean store, right on the corner of Markham and Eglinton, which they closed down. Of course, when we look at affordability and changing, a slow gentrification, because it's now a bit more rapid, but at that time. And a lot of those stores, even there's another woman, she had a store at Markham and Eglinton, and they ended up moving to Eglinton West. And even when you look at the migration of populations, there's a large Black community, Afro-Caribbean community that moved, to the West End at that time. I would say, mid to the end of the 80s, because a lot of what we would access at Fisherman or I think it's Marcia's. She has a big store now on Eglinton West, but they moved to Eglinton West for affordability because Eglinton West was still more affordable. That's right. When you look at the corner of Cedarbrae, it was Loblaws, right? Like they've now just adjusted most recently and put in a no frills. I think there's a no frills there in this particular community. So I'm speaking to you today from Kingston Road in Galloway. There's a Food Basic and a No Frills in the community, but those are more recent when you look at the timeline, right? And even still, when I go to a No Frills or a Food Basics in Whitby, I have a chance of getting organics. I mean, I could get my Beyond Burger. I can get, as a vegan, I can get organic options. When I come to this, the other day I forgot my lunch and I said, let me go into Food Basic and grab, a box of organics, not even an option. The food that was in there was actually spoiled. I took a picture of it because it was just so deplorable. And we know that historically, poverty by postal code, which is a United Way look at, the different layers of poverty, which also included food. But when we look at the postal codes that are on the common denominator around equitable access to food and income, you're going to find just the run of the mill and the poorest quality of food as options. I shared with you, I think when I started here, I was, the Kingston Road strip historically has been comparable to Southside Chicago or Detroit in terms of what is accessible food wise, right? So.
And Derek, could I just add something? Because as Uche was talking, I remembered some just some things that I saw through my travels in the north. And I've been lucky because I was able to travel and do work in many remote indigenous communities all over the country, even as far north as Nunavut up there. And I tell you, it's a real crime in terms of what's happening in these communities.
Oh yeah.
For example, there's a chain of stores in the north.
The
Oh
Northern
man,
Store.
I think
It's
it's
called
called
the
a
Northern.
Northern Store.
It's called the Northern Store. It doesn't even have a name.
Yeah, the Northern Store, and I want to say that the Northern Store has since been bought by an American company or what have you. So I've been up to Pangerton, Nunavut, which is about an hour and a half flight north of Iqaluit a number of times. And in terms of the cost of food in this
Yeah.
Northern Store in there, for example, a pound of like tomatoes was cost 13.99 per
That's right.
pound.
That's
Yeah.
A
right.
head of lettuce cost about $9.
That's
And
right.
by the time you could get to anything edible, you have to peel back maybe about 5 layers of that lettuce. Even there was a time I was in the James Bay region of northern Quebec, and I was out there and I was hungry, and it was a long travel to get up there. So I found a gas station on my way up there, and I bought a loaf of bread, a little jar of peanut butter, and they had a 2-liter bottle of iced tea, and I paid close to $40 for that.
That's right.
And
So
those are common prices. Like even a friend of mine who's still up there in Nunavut, about a year or 2 years ago, she sent me a picture of the price of a 10 pack of juice box. Juice box that we get at No Frills when they're on sale for $2. This 10 pack of juice boxes cost, I think it was 23.99
Yeah.
mhm.
for a
This is
10 pack of juice boxes. So, it's something I call it criminal in
Yes,
it
it
our
is
is.
criminal.
indigenous communities.
I do want to continue. I want to bring Tazio into this conversation because what we're talking about, this food insecurity that exists for students, because when you are a parent and you can't have access to these foods, you have in food security, we talk about kind of three things, kind of marginal food security, kind of worried about running out of money to buy food. Or you can have moderate food security where you may struggle to buy foods and you might have to skimp on nutrition. And then you have severe insecurity where you're actually missing a meal or missing an entire day of food. And certainly we look at the impact on children who are at greatest risk for this. And in terms of statistics, that over 12% of white children are food insecure and almost 34% of Black kids, 1 in 3. And these are statistics for Canada. And so for Tazio, it makes me think of the impact of this. So food insecurity among children is linked to learning problems, greater difficulty recovering from illness and long-term health problems such as depression and anxiety. I know last week we started touching on kind of mental health in the Black community. And I know today we just want to pick up that conversation as well with you.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Um, Funny, when everyone was speaking, I had this analogy in my head that when I think about food security and I think about like the injustices with law enforcement, and I'm going to double back to the mental health stuff. It's almost like the option is you die slowly. You put in a system where you die slowly through poor nutrition, or you could die speedily through police violence. And I said, the analogy is like, here's the option that are being presented to us at times, the slow, painful death. And when you think of mental health, and I'm going to probably piggyback a little bit on Nicole's stuff, that it all ties in as I was thinking, because when things are not addressed appropriately, it leads to us being in low income situation, which now exposes us to all these negative issues. And Derek, one other thing I could think about, and it's going to tie back into, I think it's all coming full circle back to Nicole, because as you said it in the intro, that when there's not opportunities, then it puts us in these low impoverished situation. That stressors, there's environmental psychology, just that itself tells you that just certain environment causes increased stress level and poor performance. So for example, they had a study that's saying that schools that are located closer to airports, those children generally do worse off than schools that are not, because of the noise pollution. Just because the environment is so toxic, it just creates that high level of stressors. So even with our community that comes from these high stress neighborhoods, just going into a classroom, the amount of thing that's on their head, that their ability to function, is impacted by that. And I say this because I remember this one story, one of the worst story I've ever come across in terms of what could happen to our community if it could put us into a low income situation. Now ties back into the the low food security and nutrition. There's a young man that I work with at the time that got expelled from a school, and I was working with him, and he went into safe schools, which is where they send young men, young black men, well, people that get in trouble. This young man was black at the time, so he went into safe schools. Everyone don't know it. If you don't know safe school, you got to go there. You got to meet some requirement, an educational requirement, a behavioral requirement, and an academic requirement to go back into the mainstream school. So this young man was there, and he was after 3 months, he should have been back in school. 6 months, he's not back there. And I got in contact with a psychologist at the time, white lady. I want to emphasize that for a reason. And we began to speak in terms of why is this young man so delayed? Like, why can't he get himself back? Because it became him and it became about his behavior. Ultimately, she said, let me just run a few preliminary tests, just to see what's going on. So she ran it. She said, based on the results that's come back, I think this young man needed some more support since school. So I'm going to do a whole fulsome test. I don't normally do this, but something's shown that this young man should have been supported more. So she anyhow did a full psychological assessment. And based on doing the full psychological assessment, she came back with two things. She said, number one, he was illegally expelled because based on some of the challenges he had, some systems, some support should have been put in place for him. For what he was expelled for, he should not have been expelled. So she said he's illegally expelled. She says based on how this current program is set up, he'll be stuck in this program indefinitely, not meeting the requirements to go back to regular school. That led to like a gamut of advocacy. Nicole talked about the IEP, individual education plan, that we had to fight for that. Ultimately, it took us getting to a place where we had the head. It was TDSB at that time, the head of the psychologist department, the head of the social work department, the head of the child and youth department. So pretty much all the heads in there's like 9 professionals and us in that meeting. And ultimately through advocacy, they lifted the expulsion and decreed that it was illegal. We were able to set up an IEP, to set up a plan for him, get him back into regular high school. And you think that this is a good story. So let me give you some of the details. It took over 2 years for this to happen. Mm-hmm. So this was a 2-year time period. Remember that he should have had an IEP from probably at least grade 7, somewhere between grade 4 and 6. So from grade 4 onward, this young man has been pushed through the school without having adequate support. So we're now at grade 11, grade 12. So that's a significant miss. I mean, that's a significant, because all they were doing was suspending the whole time. By time 2 years down the road that I got this young man into the right school with the right supports, he was disengaged. Something happened where trauma came in his life, and he fell out of the school system and got into a negative path. Because I'm telling the story to let you understand how it does not end well, even with great advocacy. Because you think of a high school young man for 2 years being expelled wrongfully because the right supports were not in place. The reason why I say this is that I remember when I was doing my placement in university, I worked with a lawyer, and the lawyer, it was a white woman that was dyslexic, and she spoke to me about how supports were put in place to allow her to be successful, have a very successful job as a lawyer. She was like over 10 years as a lawyer, definitely was going to retire, had her house, had her family, was doing well. She spoke about, throughout schools, supports was put in place. When she needed to do exams, she was sent to her room. She was given extra time. Same thing happened in university, and she showed, we're speaking, she was so sensitive to some of the issues that was going on in our community. And she said, listen, this is what happened to me. I struggled, but people saw potential in me, though I was struggling in terms of reading because of this challenge that I have, and adequate supports were put in place. We're talking about Nicole and university. And as a result, she was able to go successfully from one school to high school to university to become a very successful lawyer, to being in a high, middle class, to high, middle class, at least middle class, right? Eating nutritiously, while this young man pretty much was one of the worst treatment I've ever seen in terms of what could happen to a life, because a system don't put adequate supports in place. And as a result, back to Nicole's point, where even the IEPs, that as soon as a Black male go up on an IEP, it's almost like they have to be put into trade, or they have to be put into, at best, if they're lucky, recommended college. While here's another person that has a diagnosis of dyslexia, that has struggles, even when she was working as a lawyer, how she did her job, there's accommodations put in place. So straight through school, straight through career, supports were given. But here's something on the opposite end of the spectrum where the opposite happened. And it just shows you how one thing leads to the next, where now this young man and his family was now situated in poverty. Back to the food security. Now food security is going to be, introduced at high exposure to police and policing. And you see this deadly cycle that takes place, and how all the systems, as you said, well, Derek, all the rooms begin to overlap and spill over into each other, and this ultimate destruction that begins to happen.
Yeah. And that integration is a challenge. It's like, how do you recover from that? Like, because again, that ripple effect, it's like now income, now being able to have affordable housing, either renting or buying a place. What else is happening in his life, holding down a job, all of these things fall into place. It becomes a real big challenge. And it's sad because he's not the only student. This is a part of the conversation, is that there's just an it's not that these stories don't happen across all cultures, because they do. Across any cultural group, we have these stories. The problem that we're addressing is that there seems to be the overrepresentation of these stories happening in the Black community.
Correct. And while one group is supported and things are put in place, the other is not only are they supported, but then things are put against them to overcome.
Andrew, it brings me to what happens to these young men when, if you're not in school and you're not plugged in, what is that phrase? It's idle's time is the devil's time.
Absolutely.
You find yourself out on the street and a whole bunch of bad things, happen.
And that's what it is. And even just listening to everything and kind of putting things into context, like I often think about stories from the past too. And the frustrating thing is that what we're talking about today in 2020, it's not new. It's been happening for years, for decades, before us, and the thing is I often compare this to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was here before us, it'll be here after us. Even dating back, I think about, in the late 80s, early 90s, I was attending C.W. Jeffries as a student. And prior to that, I was always a good student, and then after, when I ended up in high school, I had a teacher come to me and say, what are you doing in school? Go out there and sell drugs like everyone else. You know what I mean? And this same teacher, maybe about 2 months after he made that comment, he started buying drugs off of me. He started buying $40 worth of hash off of me every other week. And then the thing is one day I was talking to this teacher about his purchase, and his excuse is what he told me is that every other weekend, him and his brother-in-law would go up to their cottage, and his brother-in-law likes to indulge, right? So after I told him, and I said, so I'm guessing your brother-in-law probably guessed, given that you work at a high school in the Jane and Finch community, you can access these things no problem. And he kind of gave me a wink or what have you. And, that was kind of an experience that I had growing up in high school. And, after that, it got me thinking, what am I really doing here then? You know what I mean? If he's telling me, go out there and sell drugs, and shortly after that, I'm selling him drugs, what am I really doing here? Where before that, I was always a pretty good student. And I also think about a story of a young man, and this one is going back to, oh man, it was like the early 2000s. And it's funny because this young man, he also went to C.W. Jeffries, and he was on the verge of getting kicked out of the school. So at that time, I was coordinating a program with C.W. Jeffries and Westview. It was called Freedom from Violence. And so the school, they were familiar with the work that I was doing at that time. And so they called me up. They said, Andrew, we're going to kick this young man out of school. He assaulted a teacher, and we want you to do something with him. So I said, all right, cool. Before you do any of that, let me come out to the school and come meet this young man. So this 15-year-old kid, first of all, they couldn't have kicked him out of the school because it's against the law. So after, as I started talking to this young man, he started sharing his own personal story with me, is that he came from a single parent home, mother-led home, and his mom worked she had a makeshift daycare in the home and didn't have too much time for him and stuff. So I took a liking to this young man, and I pleaded, and a word that was used earlier is advocated for this young man. And I got C.W. Jeffries to agree to keep him in the school. So I worked with him over the next 4 years, sorry. And we got him through high school, and he graduated high school. And then by the time he graduated high school, I had left. My work with the Freedom from Violence program came to an end. And I started working at a program called Toronto Youth Job Corps in the Jane and Finch community. So this young man now, he completed his high school, did very well, was always interested in plumbing. So because of my role at the Toronto Youth Job Corps, we had connections with apprenticeship programs or what have you. So I brought him over to the program. We got him into apprenticeship program. It was a struggle to get him through, but eventually he finished his 4 years, earned his ticket. Now he's a licensed plumber, working part of the union, all of that, right? Shortly after that, him and his girlfriend had a baby, had a baby together. He's working and what have you. Then maybe this is maybe about 7 years ago. Now he called me up, and because I still stay connected with him, he called me up and he said, Andrew, he goes, I need one more favor from you. I said, what's that, man? Anything, let me know. He goes, I want you to stand up beside me at my wedding. You know what I mean? So now this young man is married with a young daughter. He's a licensed plumber. Not too long ago, he bought his first townhouse, and he's living a life that he deserves. You know what I mean? It was a long, challenging road, but he overcame it. Now imagine his trajectory back when he was 15 years old. If he didn't have somebody to advocate for him or that knew how to navigate the system, because clearly at that time his mother was not familiar with how to navigate those systems or how to advocate for her child, because she was also intimidated by these systems. But imagine what his trajectory would have been if he was then kicked out of that school compared to what it is now. And the thing is, I talk about my story with my teacher, and that's dating back to 1989, 90, around there. Then I talk about this young man and his story, and we're talking about early 2000s or whatever. These things happen all the damn time, and it's frustrating. And I mean, that's the thing. We have to look at the overrepresentation, in custodial facilities, whether that be in youth centers, it could be in adult facilities and what have you, and look at it through a cultural lens in terms of how are we going to help people navigate these systems and be successful upon their release? And how can we then work with them again through a cultural lens? And what I mean by that, especially during times like this with this COVID-19 going on, we've all worked in programs and worked in the people services for a long time. And that has now changed in terms of services being offered, services being accessed, group programs that I used to, that we all worked
so
at.
Andrew, I just want to interrupt for a second because I don't want to talk too much about kind of what next steps and what we should do next. I really wanted to save that for next week. I don't know, Uche, if you had your hand up, but yes.
I wanted to make sure and pull out something there that you mentioned, something that we've made a priority in our strategic plan at the organization that I work for, is supporting parents from newcomer communities, period. But our communities are made up predominantly, the communities that we serve right now are, Afro-Caribbean, South Asian, and Indigenous. But working with the parents, like even our literacy, we partner with the Reading Partnership to specifically target parents to help them to be able to help their children.
Absolutely.
So there are a lot of parents who sign up for the program, using that one as an example, that they don't know how to, teach basic literacy skills to their children. We have to understand when we talk about cultural lens and cultural perspective, it's very important for a parent to be able to support their child through their academic journey or successfully navigate the ins and outs. Because when you think back, my husband is an educator. He teaches at in Malvern in grade 8, and he's constantly having to go with the child and their parent to the higher administration to ensure that the parents understand their rights, to ensure that the parents can completely digest what is being said. Because again, when we talk about historical trauma, when we talk about internalized oppression, if you think to your parents as first comers to, or newcomers to Canada, or your journey as a newcomer to Canada, there's this automatic submission to whatever is told to you by an institution. It's in the medical, it's in financial, in mental wellness. As soon as the doctor says that that's it, that's it. As soon as the teacher or the principal says that's it, that's it. And a lot of times we have this, the parents are approaching the institutions without information or full context and the shaping factors around what's happening to their child on a daily basis, as well as their rights around navigating the situation. So you think whatever Band-Aid solution that is thrown at you, sometimes it's not even a Band-Aid, it's just, a quick fix that actually works better for the institution. You think that that's your only option. And there needs to be, we talk about supporting children and youth, that has to, if we're looking at cultural perspective, include the parents. It has to be focusing on, we talk about, even broken family. You cannot address that with just youth and children if that's what they're seeing, and we're not having integrative conversations on a cross-generational spectrum, right?
And Ucha, sorry, Tazio, I see you. And Tazio, then I just have some questions for you, sir. Did you have your hand up, Tazio?
I'm going to default to Nicole because she's staying there so quietly. So
okay.
I know I'm more long-winded than her.
No, I was just, what Ucha was saying about tapping into the parents, the TDSB had a report, and they were looking at students who were suspended and expelled within the TDSB. And the report breaks down in terms of of race, it looks at gender, but it also looks at parents, like the income of the family, it looks at the education level of the parents. And in all the areas where parents are low income or do not have higher than a high school diploma, or or lower than a high school diploma or college diploma, their children are overrepresented in the expulsion and suspension of students. And for Black students in particular, I think it's 36% of Black students in 2017 were either suspended or expelled within that board, right? And then if we were to break down that stat even more, we would see that it's low income students, and it's also students whose parents do not have a college or above education, right? So we're looking at these rooms and how it impacts Black students in particular in the systems. Again, we're talking about what Ucha said, the parents have to also be empowered to make decisions about their children. And it goes back to those rooms, because if I don't have a certain level of education, I might not feel safe to approach a principal, right? Exactly. Or, I can't come there presenting a certain way. I don't feel safe talking to a principal. Yeah. I was saying to Derek in another conversation, there was a student whose parents were Indigenous, right? And Indigenous and Black, and their relationship with institutions rooted in residential schools, right? They were just like, I'm not coming to this school to talk to you guys because I know what happens when we come into your schools, right? And so again, the rooms where the parent, we have to bring in the conversation around community in terms of parents, extended family, and the children and the youth that we look at. Yeah.
And Nicole, you actually you mentioned something too that stood out to me, is that when parents say, we're not coming into your school, coming into your school, because that's a big issue there, because that talks about person versus the system type thing, where it's not being viewed as our school or the community school. So that's another barrier that needs to be overcome,
And I mean, I know that we're focusing on schools, but this can the same conversation can be all different types of institutions, whether it's healthcare, the justice system, and food security, like this idea of like, organizations that are even meant to feed communities, right? That kind of conversation, that relationship still happens.
That's where you see the design, like it's all mapped by design. Like you don't just have low income communities located to, food deserts, located to poor performing schools, located to no healthcare or seamless, not seamless, in seamless healthcare. It's a design, right?
Tazia?
Yeah. And I think that when, I don't know whether it was Andrew, but when someone said parent, it brought me back to something. As a professional who have been in a managerial role and throughout the government in different positions, one thing I learned that blew my mind, I learned that there was executive directors with mental health issues, managers with challenges, lawyers, doctors with challenges. And it made me begin to think that for our community, once we have a challenge, we're disqualified from success immediately. And when I began to come across these other professionals that says, yeah, I go take counseling for depression. I'm talking about people I'm reporting to, executive, people in high leadership position. I'm saying, oh my goodness, you're allowed to have issues and still be successful in life, because as it relates to our community, once there's a challenge, whether it's a mental health challenge, we're disqualified. It's like, okay, you can never be successful because you have this challenge. And when I entered into the work sphere, I'm like, oh my God, everybody has challenge. And they're making some real good money, and they have some very big portfolios, and they're doing some great stuff. So this narrative that, okay, because this young man, this young black man, had this challenge, so therefore you're disqualified from the university, or you're disqualified from the UFT faculty of doctors because you have this challenge. I'm like, oh my God, my some of my family doctors, I'm like, oh my goodness, are you sure you're good to diagnose me? Because I can see clearly that there's some issues here. And I realized, okay, society in general, none of us is perfect. We all have these issues, but we're taught how to be successful, how to navigate it, and we're taught how to access supports to overcome it. While as the black community, we're like, oh, you have a challenge, you're disqualified from the marketplace, you're disqualified from success, and you're definitely disqualified from high positions.
Tazio, I need you to flesh that out a little bit more, because I'm starting to read and we're getting a lot of questions here. So when you say we're disqualified, no one is disqualifying anybody. What do you mean by that? Flesh that out, please.
So the systems, somebody used the word gatekeepers. So the systems have made some, whether you believe it or not, systems, they have values and they have policies and they have culture. Culture is really the big part. And disqualified mean that there's systems, whether it be medical or education, when they see, from my experience, when they see, for example, specific to like a black male with a mental health issue, the system will say that, listen, this person cannot go on to success. While another person that is presented with the same symptoms says, okay, with adequate supports, with some proper counseling, some proper resource, this person could still be a doctor, this person could still be an executive, this person could still be a business leader, their potential is still there. So the system, the gatekeepers allow them to go through, while we have been trained, particularly as it starts from early education, that if you present with any challenges, sometimes it's maturity, sometimes that's how males learn. They'll be like, oh, no, you're disqualified immediately. You don't get the chance to access resource. You don't get the chance to access psychological services. You don't get the chance to access a mentor. You're just removed, and you will not be let through the gate, while other people are. And when I entered into the professional sphere, Derek, I'm like, wait a second here. There's folks here that I'm like, wow, you are a massive executive director. I mean, you're carrying ministry. There's a ministry or a massive portfolio, but you're saying that I have stress and I have to go see my psychologist after work. So how did you get through the gate? Why did the other black males that may have presented with some challenges, how did they not get through them? Sometimes it's minimal, because they had trauma and they didn't know how to work through it because the service wasn't there. Why were they not allowed to go through the gate? So sometimes systems, Derek, allow others folks to go through under the guise that, okay, they're perfect. Well, in reality, they're not.
And is this an economic problem? Is this just a finance problem that so if we wanted free therapeutic services, if we don't have a job that allows us to have coverage for it, then we have to pay out of pocket, which obviously say like $100 per hour or something like that. We just don't have the resources to do that. Is this a resource problem?
Absolutely, it begins with a resource problem, because most of the time, a lot of times, just at the beginning, if you know mental health, it gets worse, it deteriorates if it's not being supported. A lot of times you get support at the early stages, it could be addressed and people move on. But because you can't remember, people are working 3 jobs just to be able to pay rent. I remember this family I work with, they were deciding between heat and food and rent. So when you have someone in that home that needs some support, nothing massive, but you may need 10 sessions and you're looking at $1,000. Well, you're deciding already between food and heat. So your child now, you got to look at that child and says, I can't really put supports in place. And anyone knows anything about mental health or any challenges, if you don't begin to address it at this early stage, it gets to be deteriorated in such a degree. Now they're bringing medicine in to just manage it. You can't function anymore because it has deteriorated so much. And then it begins to, then these self-fulfilling prophecies be like, see, they're so bad they weren't be able to be cured in the first place. But when you work with middle class, a lot of time they're accessing these services. High school, they have the top psychologists that's working with them. Sometimes they have top psychologists are working with them just how to study, because studying creates anxiety. So they're getting the best psychologists out there just to help them to study. Well, we might have some significant trauma. You're living in low poverty neighborhoods. You're seeing things, you're experiencing things, and you can't get an hour session to deal with some massive trauma while somebody that they're paying $200-$300 just to help you to study properly.
I think something you mentioned last week, Tazio, was just coming to mind, where you were talking about the almost like the preconceived notions when diagnosing. And I think that layered onto this, because if you already have determined that when you have a predisposition, that when you're sitting with a particular client, that this is part of their culture, this is part of how they function. When we talk about being diagnosed early as violent versus having trauma, and acting out based on that trauma, that's the whole shaping factor that kind of determines that path moving on further and further. And I think that's a major piece here, is that there's also the individuals, the like you said, the gatekeepers almost are preconditioned with how they're going to diagnose. So they may be sitting, even if I can afford, because I've seen people who have the resources to get the supports and still be blocked professionally or academically, because the diagnosis is not going to be the same for a young Black male coming out of the guild. Let's say he was doing a bit better financially, as it would for a young white female coming out of the guild.
Let me just, one of the major critique for the DSM, which is a diagnostic, it's like a handbook for psychologists. One of the major critique that it has faced over the years is a lack of consideration. Clinicians are diagnosing people. And that has been one of the greatest critique against.
I'm sorry. As soon as you were talking about the critique, your microphone dropped. So you said the greatest critique was, and we didn't hear it.
Sorry, against the DSM. So the DSM is like this. It's like almost the handbook that clinicians use, particularly when it comes to mental health. And over the years, one of the big critique of it is like it doesn't take culture into consideration and like those environmental factors. It just look at people and be like behaviorally, and it works for a community that don't have all these trauma and don't have systematic racism going against it. Well, another community, when you just look at them and just begin to say, hey, this is the symptoms, and go at them, it was missing the mark. And particularly from the DSM-4 onwards, that's why they began to make some changes in terms of diagnosis, because they recognized that this model was being used negatively against a people group because certain things weren't taken into consideration.
And Tazio, he raised a good point last week too, is that more or less mentioning that undiagnosed or untreated mental health challenges often spiral to a point where they're then treated within custodial facilities or in the jails. And that's a major issue there, because if some form of intervention can happen prior to that in the form of treatment or something, then certainly you would see a decrease in those numbers inside the custodial facilities.
And then there's also policy and procedure. Like we have to look at, there's a lot of policy that's set up to hold a lot of those initial diagnoses in place. When you look at OSRs, when you look at criminal records, when you look at, there is there's a lot of barriers that are held in place by systemic policy that was created, in my opinion. to be kind of the sieve, right?
Yeah.
Because you have an individual who's conditioned, and then they have policy to back up their position, right?
Uche, I always recommend it to every parent to look at their child's OSR and Terry student record before they go to grade 9. Because I learned in advocacy that a lot of time notes are made on it, like, so I've seen an OSR that says this young man's like a criminal. It's not an official part of the record, but there's a notation on the record that when it goes to other school, then they'll see it as simple. Like, well, there's one notation so cruel that this is like this young man is exhibiting criminal behaviors or something like that.
And then the stigma is
for those notes to be written up because they're not official record, but they make notation on it. That when so now they're carrying this image and they don't know why they're getting suspended, but other principals are looking at this OSR and seeing that these little slide notes in the side margins and making decisions based on those.
That's right, and they basically put them all out. They break everything up. Like I've seen, my husband shares all the time where he usually gets the class with the hardest because that's his thing. He but they'll have notes that'll say, don't put this child in a class with this other particular child, or don't put them in a class where there's too many males because of, and so it's this, this continual layering on of judgment that never, everybody has parents even have this notion that your child is starting fresh. You would hear that from your parents. I remember growing up, say you had a hard year, your mother would say, this is a new start this year, or whatever. Realistically, it's not a new start for the institution. No. And we also have this almost God lens, as I could think back to my mother and my grandmother, where it pertains to teachers and people in higher institution, not realizing, a lot of these folks are alcoholics. A lot of these folks are going, like you said, through their own mental illness challenges. They're going through many, divorces, all different things that we are going through. And they impact, even how they address their work on a day-to-day basis. And it almost for a large majority is just sorting to make the workload easy, I remember my husband going to this school in Malvern, and all of the teachers trying to offload the hard students because they said, "Oh, you're a Black male, so you take all of them." Which he.
I want to be mindful of the time. It's now 10:07. We were supposed to have a hard stop at 10 o'clock, but really quickly, Tazio, I just want to ask you just one question before I get to the other questions that kind of been posed online, and we talked briefly about that jails are the biggest mental health hospitals that we have. So many of those incarcerated do have mental health, and obviously that Blacks are overrepresented in the jails. And so I just think about that reintegration and the challenges they face as they then come out of that. I certainly can think of in my mind individuals who who have, unfortunately, instead of being able to just easily get out for a crime, not having the resources to be able to get out, either because they don't have the right bail in place. And so they can end up spending a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks just trying to get everything to meet the bail conditions to get out. In some, they can never get out. That is to say, they have to wait until the case goes to trial, and so they're in there. And I think then about the reintegration back into the community and the challenge that they experience coming out.
Having worked in a maximum detention center, worked in youth justice like Andrew, you hit it on the nail, Derek, in terms of no matter how much change these young men make, one of the things that happens when you go into institution, you get disconnected from a lot of societal stuff. So people always think, okay, they come out, you make a change automatically. Most of us don't understand how much systems we're connected into. We're connected into jobs and services and sports programs and our own little clubs. So all of us are connected in community. So when they go into these institutions, they're cut away, they're literally cut off from community. And then coming back out, they lack the resources, because there's this perception that, okay, they went in, but they didn't change. So they will always lack mental health resources. There's always a wait list, and there's really just one Black community agency that I know of, and they're overwhelmed. Just got a text like, hey, we're inundated. So number one, just general mental health services, there's a wait list for everybody. And then a culturally sensitive services, then that's almost like non-existent. So to reintegrate them, the first thing is to reconnect them back to community.
Yeah.
But then there's these systems that really just keeps up these like, no, you're not going to be reconnected,
Yeah.
which now puts them in a dilemma like, okay, I'm out now, but I'm not reconnected to anything. How long can I stay just doing nothing with my
Yeah.
life? Well, the only community I know is the criminal one, so I got to reconnect back because the
Yeah.
other one has abandoned me. And most people just don't understand. It's such an unconscious functioning how much
Yeah.
things we're a part of or we're connected. That's why we do so well. We have family settings, we have our different organization, we have a religious setting, and then we have our careers, we have our sports clubs that have that. But these young men that comes out, the
Mhm.
stigma over their life
Yeah.
is that they're not accepted back into community as we think they are,
Yeah.
but they're not. So even when they're at the place of change, without community, nobody excels.
Yeah.
Nobody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everybody is successful because of community. Everybody.
And I want to end with that and begin to answer this question because it helps us to look forward to next week. It's like, so where do we go from here? How do we help? How do we become allies, in this struggle? Because like you said, they can't do it alone. They can't be siloed, and it impacts every room in our house. It's like now you've come out, you've missed that education. So now you've missed the opportunity for different career opportunities,
Mhm.
which means that you're probably not making a high income, which means you're higher at risk for having a food insecure house, and children thinking about skipping a meal or figuring out what type of foods that we can get that are not high nutrient rich, and then coming back to mental health. What then is the impact of having children that aren't having nutrient rich foods? And then we talked about that anxiety, depression, and then we talk about these behaviors. The child now is acting out, which then means this child is then going to get labeled, and then the cycle continues of higher expulsion suspension rate all over again. So now all of the houses begin to get connected.
Mhm.
I'm going to end with some questions that I've seen online. Kind of touched on the first one when Nicole was talking, but the question is, why are Black teachers so unrepresented? What are the barriers?
So I remember when I was going to teachers college, and um, after I had, graduated from the program, and I went to go speak to a principal who was at the time in the Durham board, and she had showed me a picture of the administrators in her quad at the time, and she was the only Black woman there, right? We don't necessarily have the community, like Tazio was saying, to encourage us to go into education a lot of the times, right? If my mom did it, my dad did it, my aunt did it, I saw, my neighbor doing it, then I can see myself doing it a lot of the time. So that's one. The second thing is, prior to going into teachers college, you have to do some volunteer hours in like a school. Sometimes you need to do volunteer hours in an agency. You just need to work with youth. If you don't have people in your community who, like, in your network, right? Because we're talking about, a lot of times what we're exposed to is a part of our network. Who do we know? Our parents, our aunts, our uncles, our family members. If you don't have someone in your network that you can tap on and say, hey, can I come to your school and volunteer? Then that writes you off right there, because you have to have a certain amount of hours to get into any teacher's college. The part of the application is you must have X amount of hours working with children and youth, and especially in a school situation. I was fortunate enough for myself to be working at a youth organization prior to going to teachers college twice in my life. And that helped me, but I didn't have anyone necessarily to lean on to tell me what are the buzzwords that I need to put into my application. What do they really look for in my application? And so a lot of times those are like barriers that are not explicit, but they're implicit, right? That was also part of that U of T medical school. If you had someone that could write you a reference letter, right, to give you access to get even through the interview process, right? So it's not that Black teachers or Black people don't want to be educators. It's like the pathway or the gate to get that um, that is, it's not a level playing field. It isn't. And you really do have to jump a lot of hoops to get there. I definitely see, I've been, seeing changes in terms of the Black teachers coming in particular in like POR positions or, principal positions or VP positions. But when I first started teaching, there were not a lot of Black teachers.
Mm-hmm. Next question. How much does mismanagement of income contribute to food insecurity, if at all? So the question is around mismanagement of money. How does that connect, if at all?
I think when we look at the narrative of people that are grappling with paying, their hydro or paying, their phone bill or paying some type of a resource that they need for survival in order to, maintain their day to day, juxtapose, their food access. When you're starting with, $2 as trying to make $1 out of 15 cents, miss the way that you allocate that, there are individuals who are, whatever decision they make, something is going to drop, right? And so the reality is that, most people will take food as the common item to kind of overlook and or at least to reduce as far as investing resources towards, because you know depending culturally your makeup, you learn to survive on a very little. I remember, I know families that drank porridge at nighttime instead of dinner because that was just going to fill their stomachs for the evening, and then you would look at it the next month. And so it's not to make a judgment. There's always a push to say, well, I think this may become, I'm not gonna, but what I'm interpreting in that question is that people look at, housing communities, they look at low income communities and say, well, you know what, I see children coming out of there in Jordans, I see them in the new clothes. Mm-hmm. Why aren't the parents just buying, and you have to understand there's a whole psychological makeup. Sometimes that aren't their Jordans are armor, like we don't even, yeah. Sometimes it's there's so many different shaping factors into mm-hmm. why those decisions are made. You can't just make a cut and dry judgment, right? Mm-hmm.
I would, if I could, I would like to say to the individual that there's actually, in prepping for today's webinar, I did a lot of research on food security. And again, I referenced earlier on this report. It's by the University of Toronto, and the authors are Simran Duna and Valerie Tarasuk. And I'd encourage you to take a look at it because there's a wealth of Canadian literature on this very specific subject in particular. And then the communities that we really highlight are the Indigenous communities and the Black communities in particular, where had families with really high food insecurity. And it didn't talk about that, but it did talk about different things. Such as being kind of house poor, that you could be a Black person, you could be in a nice neighborhood and in a community where you're owning your own home, but your mortgage payments are just so high that you're really struggling to afford mortgage and also food. Myself and my wife, we both have very successful, thankfully we're grateful to have really well-paying careers, and still from times where it's like, look at these berries, the cost of blackberries and blueberries. I just don't think that we're going to be buying that this week. Good thing bananas are on sale, right? And we don't, our kids, pretty much all of our stuff is hand-me-downs. But so I understand the thought behind it, like Ucha said, when you see kids with Jordans or flat screen TVs. But the research goes much deeper than that, and it's not about that. It has to do with just even lower paying jobs. Yeah. Jobs that don't have pensions, jobs that don't have security, jobs that don't have benefits for a lot of the community, being house poor and stuff, not being able to have enough credit to even rely on, or even then having that head start early on in life. That is that most of our students don't have an opportunity to have their parents pay for them through university, or with the first down payment of the house and stuff. There's a whole bunch of systemic problems that have happened before this that lead us to kind of this problem. But I would encourage you to take a look at that study again by Simran Duna and Valerie Tarasuk from the University of Toronto. It's a really good one. And there's tons of literature on this specifically about Canada. You don't have to look at stats in states.
Yeah, I think also I want to mention that the Broadbent Institute
Oh, good.
Actually,
Thank you.
just this year did a big, really good position
Good.
on this, and it actually addresses this particular concern because it is a concern not just around the income insecurity, but also the choice of how you allocate income, which
Mhm.
also I think is a very, this comes up time and time again, especially in conferences where we're looking at the Black communities within low income community and how culturally the cultural makeup and how choices are made based on our decision making options, right? So it's very important to it's a whole, I think, series in itself,
Yeah.
but it's very important to highlight that as well.
Question 3. How do you differentiate between microaggressions and genuine ignorance? First of all, let's define this. What is a microaggression?
So microaggression so especially in Canada, because we're very politically correct, supposedly. I had a cousin who did his PhD at McMaster, and he brought up in Brooklyn, and he said he thinks Canada is the most racist because we have passive racism, and microaggression is a tool that is used to almost blanket. So my husband is almost 7 foot. People will always, oh, well, what's the air up there? That's a microaggression, or they'll, when we talked about the story last session around Black people's hair not getting wet, like just having the comfort of making statements that are actually racist, but are commonly accepted by by everyone as being normal, because these are the comments that your coworker might say, "Hey, why are you getting so upset about that?" Everybody, like even somebody from your race or culture, may say, "Oh, they didn't mean anything by it," but they're obviously micro, but many aggressions against a person that are passive. So,
Yeah.
can be anything about your food and and so the difference is that they're hidden in common, they're commonly accepted a lot of times too.
And so
You
what
know,
is the difference between that and just,
they
and what
happen
is,
so frequently,
oh, yeah.
so much that they become a part of like how we interact verbally, socially.
You
That's right.
become conditioned in a sense.
yeah. And so
So
the
you look
difference
at
is, what would be the difference between that and just genuine ignorance? My hair is different from your hair. Let me touch your hair. Wow, that feels very different. Like, what is the difference?
Well, the thing, I think of my sons. My two older sons are 6'3" and 6'4". People, one son is very athletic. He's done basketball's his thing. The other one, who's actually slightly shorter, but at the same time, he's 6'3". People automatically assume that he should be playing basketball. Like that's
Yeah.
just teachers see him anywhere he goes. It's an assumption. If he doesn't do it, something's wrong with him. That's and that in itself is a microaggression, right? Like this automatic assumption, just like when we look at Trayvon Martin and the hoodie, right? Like that automatic assumption. When you see blatant racism, or are you looking at blatant racism or blatant ignorance? Like they didn't. If you're looking at blatant ignorance, it could be, I remember meeting somebody from like Estonia, like the first time they'd ever come to Canada. They'd never had experiences with Black community up until that point. And then he had these questions that to me sounded like ignorant, but because of his place base and his actual context of community where he grew, he would not have known, like it was an assumption that all Caribbean people were Jamaican. Like he just thought all Caribbean people spoke with Jamaican accents, right? Which we know, growing up is a common thing. So there are, and it also, go ahead, Nicole.
I was going to say, I think when I think about microaggressions and just being just ignorant, right? There's this power dynamic behind the microaggression, right? That is, it's silent, but it's deadly, right? So, for example, if I bring my lunch to work, right, and it's like curry goat and something or another, and you're like, "What's that?" and versus what's that? Like, you know what I mean? There's this connotation, like the meaning and the feeling behind the phrase or the statement, right? You're pretty. You're pretty for a Black girl, right? Like, like it is the feeling and the power dynamic that's behind microaggressions versus just, you know what, I just want to know. And you can feel it, right? Like there is this clear.
You as the person experiencing it can feel it, but the person as the aggressor thinks that this is commonly accepted banter. So, you know, I remember working at a funeral home, and they every lunch, because at that time I ate meat, they'd ask me what Looney Tune was I eating, because Caribbean people ate Looney Tunes. Like, and they all laughed and thought it was like, this was, you know, commonplace and okay. I was in high school at the time, so I stopped bringing my lunch. I started buying pizza just because, you know, so the impacts, right? Like, if it's like somebody taking a pin and constantly pricking you every single day, right? Eventually, you're gonna get a numbness, or you're gonna, you know, it's gonna have a long-term impact.
And I just want to add a quick note there. Sorry, that the standard of ignorance is high. People always say, is it ignorant? But the threshold of ignorance is extremely high to meet. Because oftentimes when you have those prejudice, there's an entitlement that comes with those things. So really, to say it's ignorant is to say that I have no prejudice or biases behind this action. That's a very high threshold to meet. Most people just think that I'm ignorant, but you're trying to say that I have no biases towards this cultural group that gives me an entitlement to make certain comments, as opposed to, you know, an inquiry with honor and respect. So I just want to say that most time we use ignorant as something that is a low threshold, but it's a very high one to meet.
That's right.
That's really good.
Really good.
I agree with you.
I have a couple questions here that I'm going to table for next week, because again, our focus is how do we move forward from here? Where do we go? So the question is, where and how does resilience fall into this? Well, this is a good question for next week. How do we move forward? So I'll table that. Also, the next question, are there programs to educate parents on how to advocate for their children? So we'll talk about that. And then which agencies support them actually, or where can we get help? And stuff. So actually, those are all the questions, and I'm looking at the time.
Just one more thing. That person that asked about the microaggressions, there's a really good video I think on YouTube by I think it's BuzzFeed, and it literally labels microaggressions as a nasty mosquito, right? And I think it does a really good job of like explaining what a microaggression is. So if you're interested in just watching that video, it would help to, you know, just help you understand a little bit more in a language that's easy to understand.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff out there on microaggression. And
well, Ucha and Andrew and Nicole and Tazia, we went over, but I really appreciate all of you.
An hour and a half, Derek. Sorry.
I know. Next
do we still got people with us?
Yes, and then Audrey behind the scenes. So thanks so much once again. I really appreciate all of you. We'll see you guys next time for the final installment of this webinar, which is forming allies and moving forward.
Thank you,
Have
Derek.
a good night,
Cheers.
everyone.
Good
Thanks
night.
for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.